You told CTV News explicitly on July 12 that the splitting of profits or net revenue with the U.S. from the Gordie Howe Bridge would only happen after accounting for the debt of the bridge, but that's not what the text of the new deal says. So, was that a lie?
Today, the opening ceremony for the Gordie Howe Bridge was held, but the shine has definitely worn off the build-up to it. After Canada paid for the bridge, surrendered half the toll revenue for 15 years, and still failed to secure relief from Donald Trump, the ceremony looks less like a victory and more like a humiliation for Mark Carney, who walked Canada directly into it. Is it any wonder that the man who lied to the nation about the deal that was included and still maintains that that was a good deal was nowhere to be found? Let's take a look. So this is the opening ceremony for the bridge, folks, and you had Indigenous leaders, you had municipal leaders, you had the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, you had Gregor Robertson, who is the one of the ministers there. You had lots of people from lots of different places. But the one person that you would think probably should be there and wasn't was the man who basically screwed this whole thing up, which was Mark Carney. Mark Carney, just for context, he managed to attend virtually every single soccer game or football game, depending on where you come from, for the World Cup. But if you count the amount of times that he's actually been to Windsor since the election, that number would amount to 0. He seems to have some sort of allergic reaction to Windsor, Ontario, to Sarnia, Ontario. Don't really know why, but that reaction is there, and that avoidance has become very, very clear. Now, this all came to a head, as everybody knows, because Donald Trump ended up getting angry and decided that he wasn't going to let this bridge open. Now, there's a lot of reporting on that both in the United States and Canada, that the reason for that is because one of his major donors actually owns the Ambassador Bridge, which up to now has been virtually the only crossing for trucks to get across between Michigan and Windsor. And they didn't really want the new bridge opened, and this was a way for them to delay it, and who knows what the end game actually was. But in the end, Donald Trump forced the Canadian government into a compromise in order to actually open the bridge. They didn't have to do this. There was originally a deal signed between Canada and the state of Michigan over what was going to happen with the bridge. And Michigan refused to finance any of it, so Canada said, okay, under Stephen Harper, we'll build the bridge, we'll finance the bridge, and after it's all paid off, we'll split some revenue with you. So, seemed like a pretty good deal for Michigan because they don't have to build anything, they don't have to finance anything, and eventually, when the bridge is paid off, then they get some toll revenue. Sounds good. Well, Donald Trump said, no, that's not going to happen, and forced Mark Carney into negotiating a position where the net revenue of the first 15 years, before debt is actually paid off, 50% of that actually goes to the United States, and they get to do whatever they want with it. Mark Carney, Mark Garrettson, and other liberals were trying to say, no, this wasn't true. And that, we're paying off the debt before this happens. And everybody else that is saying anything otherwise is a liar, they're putting out misinformation, etc. Well, as we all know, the original or the actual deal or side deal for the Gordie Howe Bridge that was agreed upon by Mark Carney and Donald Trump was probably reluctantly published earlier this week, and we reported on that. So it was very interesting yesterday after Donald Trump threatened yet another round of tariffs, and since then he's basically said he's going to put even more tariffs on Canada and 60 other countries related to child labor, but that's for a different discussion. It was fascinating when a mainstream media outlet actually asked Mark Carney if he blatantly lied to Canadians about this. And this was his response.
Question, question. Next question.
Maria Saru, CTV News. For the Prime Minister, you told CTV News explicitly on July 12 that the splitting of profits or net revenue with the U.S. from the Gordie Howe Bridge would only happen after accounting for the debt of the bridge, but that's not what the text of the New Deal says. So, was that a lie, and were you downplaying your concessions to Trump?
Thank you for the question. First, let's be clear about what the deal is and isn't with respect to the bridge. And the first thing is, this is a good deal. This is a good deal for Canadian businesses, workers. It's a good deal for the future of our commerce with them. Put in context, there is about $300 billion a year of trade on the land link between Michigan and Ontario. And Premier Ford knows every dime of that trade. He's got it tracked. So $300 billion, a huge amount of trade. So this creates an important link, and it's an absolute, it's an engineering marvel, and it's a testament to the workers who created it. So that's. Secondly, the underlying agreement between Canada and Michigan remains in place. That's the underlying full text, weighty agreement. I'm illustrating the thickness of that agreement. It's in the public domain. Under that agreement, there is no splitting of tolls under that agreement, which is what I was referring to, perhaps imperfectly, but there's no splitting of tolls under that agreement until all of the debt is repaid, debt from Canada. For reference, and it depends on how much traffic, and there's various sensitivities, but for reference, that's about 50 years. It takes about 50 years for that to kick in. In parallel with this, there is an agreement in principle, which was published earlier this week, between Canada and the United States. And under that agreement, there is a sharing of net revenues after operating expenses, various other expenses, not including debt repayment. I should have been clear, that's referred to in the Michigan agreement with respect to tolls, but that is under the parallel agreement. But the sharing of proceeds with the United States goes into economic development that would support traffic ultimately on the bridge. So there's an alignment of incentives. The combination of that agreement and the sharing under that, it is a very marginal impact on the overall economics. Okay, very marginal, because it takes time for traffic to ramp up. There's various costs, there's various sharing. It gets fed back in. And to put it in order of magnitude, it's less than 5% in present value of the overall cost of developing the bridge. So that's the overall what it is, what it isn't. And yeah, could I have explained it better on a Sunday morning at Stampede? Yeah, with a cowboy hat on? Yes, I could have explained it better. And I explained it better in London, Ontario at GDLS, but I appreciate the opportunity. And
So his excuse was, well, I was wearing a cowboy hat. You can't expect me to talk about the nature of an economic trade deal when it comes to a international bridge with a cowboy hat on a Sunday, can you? Yeah, we can, Prime Minister. That's literally your job. I'm able to do my job with and without a cowboy hat. And I speak from experience. Some would say I do my job better with a cowboy hat, but, that's up for discussion in the comments. Now, the fact that he's trying to say also, I was talking about the original agreement that was signed way back in 2012. Really? Really, Mark? That's your other excuse that you're trying to throw out there? Oh yeah, I wasn't talking about the new deal. I was talking about the old deal. Wait a minute. So when you were specifically asked what are the terms of the new deal in order to reopen the Gordie Howe Bridge when Trump shut it down, your response is that, well, I was talking about the original deal that had nothing to do with the question. Give me a break. And he knows darn well what he was talking to, because then he tries to downplay the actual result of the now released details of that principal agreement that he was talking about by saying, oh, well, you know, it's no big deal. It's less than 5% of the cost of the overall bridge. Maybe. But, ladies and gentlemen, what is 5% of the cost of the overall bridge? Cost of the bridge is $6.4 billion. Okay? So what's 10% of that? That's $640 billion. So what's half of that to get to Mark Carney's 5%? That's $320 million. Is that per year? Is that per month? Per decade? I don't know. Mark Carney doesn't like being specific. So $320 million. I could use $320 million. Could you use $320 million? I think a lot of Canadians could use $320 million. So when he's trying to downplay this and trying to say, this is a good deal. No, Mark, it's not. It actually isn't. You bent the knee to Donald Trump once again. Because you're in a position where you could say, Don, we already have a contract. You don't get to just rip up a contract. It's legally binding between two countries. What the heck? You don't want this bridge open? Explain that to all of the people on the American side that don't want it open. Like, this is not a good deal. The fact that you had to give up anything and not receive anything in return, what you receive in return is they were going to open the bridge. Wow. What a great deal, Mark. This is the same guy who said he was never going to make a bad deal. He'd rather have no deal than a bad deal. Well, you know, as Shivalay Majumdar said on our show, he already has a bad deal. Just isn't signed. We showed you what the tariffs were when Mark Carney took over and what they are now. And it's funny because that chart is now out of date because of the new tariffs that Donald Trump said he was going to bring in today. Not coming into effect today, but he announced them today. Now, speaking of all that, he was never, ever in Windsor. He was not at the opening of that bridge that he said was such a good deal. And this is significant, folks, because Windsor is where the vast majority of the businesses that are affected by the 232 tariffs that came in April of this year, that's where they are. All those businesses that came up to committee for that emergency meeting at the industry committee that we covered, and we went to the mold manufacturers AGM and we interviewed a bunch of people there. That's where they are mostly located. Mark Carney has never been there. Why is that? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's because the Conservatives had pretty much a clean sweep of Windsor. It's evident that Mark Carney doesn't go to ridings where he didn't actually win a seat for the Liberals. And this is the Prime Minister who said, oh, I'm the Prime Minister of all Canadians. Really? All Canadians? Or just the Canadians that voted for you? Because that's what the latest floor crosser, Marilyn Gladue, said. She said, well, I wasn't getting any funding. And I was told in order to get funding, I had to cross. So I don't see how Liberals could be happy with this. You're dividing the country politically by saying, you don't get anything if you don't vote for me. It's disgusting, and it just further shows the lack of respect for the democratic system in this country. You don't get to run Canada like a CEO. You don't get to run it like Brookfield. So this is something that Canadians should have in the back of their minds. Like, he will not visit these businesses, and the businesses are nonpartisan. They just want to do business. But he's willing to sacrifice all of these businesses just so he can continue to make Donald Trump angry, to sour the relationship with our closest ally. Donald Trump has his side of this too. It's ridiculous the amount of tariffs that he's throwing up there and the excuses that he's making. Let's just make that perfectly clear. Donald Trump is far from innocent on this. We started the Kuzma violations. Donald Trump started the tariff war. So we both have a hand in this. Takes two sides to maintain a relationship. Donald Trump seems to be making a relationship with Mexico just fine, not with Canada, because Canada has been absent from the negotiating table. Now, speaking of negotiating, Mark Carney and all the premiers came out yesterday and said, we're going to do anything necessary. Okay. What does that mean, Mark?
Next question. Prochaine question.
David Aiken, Global News. Good afternoon, Premiers, Prime Minister. I have a question for the Prime Minister. You said this morning that all these governments would do whatever it takes to defend and support our families, our business, etc. And I'd like to hear after 3 hours of meeting, some specifics. Counter tariffs are a possibility, and so on. If you could provide some specifics. And then two, let's say you get this deal, CUSMA 2 with the President of the United States. You're going to have to convince a lot of Canadians skeptical of the trustworthiness of the president that no, this time he means it. He'll keep his word this time on CUSMA 2. How will you explain that the president can be trusted when he signs a document with your name on it? Thank you.
Well, first, in terms of doing whatever it takes, there's multiple aspects of that. First, and I won't repeat the whole element of, but it's building the economy and support. Like that's fundamental. It's diversifying our trade relations. Is all that. Secondly, it is helping those sectors that are affected directly by the tariffs with financial support, supporting their workers, reorienting demand for some of their products where that's possible, providing some level of trade protection, if necessary, remissions, other aspects. So there's a variety of things, and we're working through that. We've been doing this and supporting literally tens of thousands of jobs in the 232 sectors, the strategic sectors, steel, aluminum, automobiles, and others, and we'll continue to do that with other sectors that are affected. The third is responding. If these tariffs or other measures come into force, and there's a full range of things that we can do in that regard. We don't need to respond in advance. In fact, I think it would be counterproductive at this stage to respond in advance. But it's important to know what your options are, to have worked it through, to have shared as it affects certain provinces or they have perspectives directly, and be united in that response. And I would say, and premiers obviously speak for themselves, we are united in direction and objective and purpose and seriousness about the response. We are going to support Canadian families, workers, businesses, full stop. Now, to the second part of your question, first, I have to be convinced, we have to be convinced, the team has to be convinced, the premiers have to be convinced that an agreement is worth the paper it's written on, and I think at the core of that is that the agreement recognizes the benefits, the very, very many benefits that trade with Canada brings, not just to Canadians, but to Americans. I mean, it's their self-interest. But it has to recognize, so it has to be aligned, has to have provisions that reinforce, of course. But we will know when we see it. And I would say, we go in from Missouri, to use an American expression, on this. With wide eyes, lots of options, rolling up our sleeves, doing the work. We're working on behalf of Canadians, we'll know it when we see it. And final point, there are other things we could have done in the intervening time that we didn't do in agreements, perhaps because of the nature of your question.
Okay, folks. I know it was a word salad, but the number one thing I want to point out is we're going to do whatever it takes. Apparently what isn't included in that is actually negotiating. Negotiating is not in Mark Carney's plan to do whatever it takes. But he says, oh, well, we'll know it when we see it. I'll know the deal. So Mark Carney is sitting there saying, well, the Americans have to give us an offer. What? That's not negotiating. It really isn't. The Americans have conveyed all of their trade irritants, whether it be through Donald Trump, which I'm leaving over here, but through his staff. And we pretty much know a lot of them. So the Americans said, this is what our issue is. What they're wanting Canadians to do is to respond to that and say, okay, here's what we'll do. And we want investment. Here's what we'll put on the table. That's what we heard from Ambassador Hoekstra. But Mark Carney isn't willing to do that. He even said at the end, oh, well, you know, there's a bunch of deals that we could have made, but we didn't. Okay, so what Mark Carney is trying to say is, well, we're not going to make a deal with Donald Trump because we can't trust him to begin with. Therefore, Canadians are going to continue to suffer. And therefore, our plan is just to print more money and throw it at Canadian businesses. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Liberal plan for the last 10 years. Everyone said it was going to change. Well, not everybody. Everyone who voted for Mark Carney and the mainstream media said it was going to change when Mark Carney took office. Nothing has changed. Nothing. The only thing that has changed is the guy in front of the microphone. The strategy is exactly the same, no matter what the issue is. We're not going to actually develop a plan. We're just going to throw money at it. We're going to make a bunch of announcements. Nothing actually gets done. But through these announcements, we're going to try and convince everybody that we're actually doing work. All this has been, folks, is a giant humiliation of Mark Carney. And I'm sorry if folks are watching that may have voted for him. I'm sorry you were duped. I truly am. Nothing would have made Canada better than if all of the stories actually were true. That he would have come in and gotten a deal with Donald Trump. He would have opened up all of our resources. We would have gotten pipelines. We would have gotten all... Canada would be in a much better spot than it was right now. But unfortunately, folks, it's not true. You were lied to. Mark Carney continues to lie to you. After he's caught lying, he lies to you again and doesn't even show up for the bridge that he's so proud of the deal that he just negotiated for. Because he knows he is getting completely schooled in this. He doesn't know how to handle Donald Trump. He doesn't know how Donald Trump negotiates. He doesn't know how to get a deal with Donald Trump. And he knows that any deal that he gets is not going to be a good one. But he also knows is that whatever deal he gets, that is going to be the nail in the Liberal coffin, because that will expose Mark Carney. Canadians will see that the main thing that he's been promising on and main thing that he got elected on is his ability to get a deal with Donald Trump. It will be there for all to see that the deal that he got is a terrible one for Canada. And that will be his downfall. That's my prediction at this point. You're going to see this gradual decline in the Liberal polls. It's just going to be here and there. There's going to be little fluctuations, but it's going to gradually decline because Canadians, like, doesn't here, doesn't there, doesn't here, doesn't here. They are going to slowly wake up and see that nothing is getting done. He's not getting the results. And if he can't even negotiate to get a bridge open that we paid for, that we financed, that we're maintaining, if he can't negotiate a bloody bridge, Liberal voters, how is he going to negotiate a multilateral North American trade deal with the United States and Mexico? Well, mark my words, whatever that deal ends up being, it's not going to be anywhere near to what we have now, and Canadians everywhere are going to see it.